Okay, well, I think we'll kick things off. Hi, my name's Scott Lenny, and welcome to the first of our 6-part Cyber Risk Masterclass, designed to empower you to better understand, manage, and seek protection for your organisation's cyber risks. As the cyber threat landscape continues to grow more complex for organisations across all industries, every business is facing a significant challenge in protecting its information assets and operations. The World Economic Forum 2020 Executive Opinion Survey asked over 12,000 executives from around the world to give their opinions on the top 5 global risks for doing business in their country. And as you can see here, cyber risk ranked number 1 for advanced economies, topping the list in North America, the UK and Australia, and ranked 4th in New Zealand. Recognising that our clients need help to assess risk, manage response, and arrange insurance for cyber exposures, over a number of years, we built a market-leading global cyber practice at Marsh and invested in specialist cyber resources on the ground here in the Pacific. Led by the irrepressible Kelly Butler, who you'll hear from in a moment, who joined Marsh in 2016, the team for Australia and New Zealand has grown to 7 senior team members across cyber advisory and placement to make sure that we can meet the growing demand. More recently, we've appointed Fiona Fong, an experienced lawyer, to lead our dedicated cyber claims offering, and also Faisal Janif as head of cyber consulting. Faisal brings over 20 years of experience in cybersecurity, working in business on information and operational technology, and also in cyber consultancy roles across Asia Pacific. And we're also delighted to have Christine Salgado back with us, who many of you would know. She was recently been on maternity leave, so welcome back. The cyber insurance market is young in age, but has developed very quickly. The Australian introduction of mandatory data breach notification in February 2018 was a catalyst for cyber insurance take-up, as it was before in the US. However, the recent ransomware and malware attacks have really driven increased demand, and all at a time where the insurance market is starting to run scared. So we'll be delving into this in a little more detail, but right now I'll hand over to Damien Shink, who will be our moderator for our first session in this masterclass series. Over to you, Damien.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Scott. In this opening to our Cyber Master series, Marsh have brought together our global cyber leaders to provide a comprehensive update on both the cyber threat landscape being faced by our clients and a timely insurance market update. So joining us today on the panel, first is Kelly Butler. So Kelly, as Scott briefly mentioned, oversees the client advisory and placement services for cyber and technology risks throughout the Pacific region, working closely with many of you on this call who have joined us today. Kelly serves as the Senior Cyber Risk Advisor for many of Marsh's clients and sits on the Marsh Global Cyber Board. Kelly joined Marsh in 2016 to build Marsh's cyber practice and has over 21 years insurance experience gained in Australia, New Zealand and the UK, with the last 14 years spent designing cyber and financial lines insurance programs for large corporate and publicly listed clients. Before joining broking, Kelly worked with leading global insurers in claims management, handling complex liability, directors and officers, and professional indemnity litigation, and now plays a leading role in our incident response on claims advocacy as we continue to see a sharp rise in cyber claims notifications. Joining Kelly is Tom Regan. Tom is the cyber practice leader for the US, located in Marsh's New York office. Like Kelly, Tom oversees client advisory and placement services for cyber risks, however, throughout the US, and chairs Marsh's Global Cyber Board. Recognised as a global cyber industry leader, Tom began his career in the technology industry as an expert on security and service delivery. In 2003, Tom joined American International Group, better known as AIG, where he managed professional liability underwriting for AIG's largest clients in the US and Canada. Later, Tom joined Beazley, a global specialty insurance carrier, where he led marketing and strategy for Beazley's cyber insurance division before joining Marsh in 2014. And rounding up this wonderful panel is Scott Lenny. Scott oversees Marsh's regional risk management teams in Asia and the Pacific. So he's my boss. And the whole mandate of the risk management team is to build on existing capabilities and develop strategic solutions that will enable Marsh's largest clients to navigate an increasingly complex global risk landscape. Scott also double hats and serves as the country corporate officer for Marsh and McLennan in Australia. So what Scott does, he works with our Marsh and McLennan executives across our 4 business units, being Marsh, which is our broking business, Guy Carpenter, Mercer, and Oliver Wyman. And that's to bring the integrated solutions to clients across the fields of risk, strategy, and people. So let us begin. What we'll do, we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the panel discussion. And so we'd ask you, if you've got any questions, to submit them via the chat function. Everyone's on mute, so we won't get the feedback. So why don't we crack on with the first slide. So, all right, Kelly and Tom, let's get started with providing our audience with an update on the evolving landscape being experienced both locally and globally. Over to you, Kelly.
Thanks, Damien. I'll jump in first and cover off the local landscape. So as you all know, and I'm sure a few of you have seen this slide now, it is evolving, and we say that a lot in cyber, but it is true. So we're seeing much more targeted and more ambitious attacks. You only need to see the headlines, read the headlines to see that. So new and emerging attacks group, refinements of the tools and tactics that they're using. And there is a lot of big game hunting, and we have certainly seen some of our clients experience some of that. There's some new target and access points, supply chains, and I know you hear a lot from me on supply chain vulnerability, but this is really where we're seeing a lot of the claims come in, where they've found some vulnerability in your supply chain. COVID-19, I am sure everyone's sick of talking about COVID-19, but it has created a substantial increase, obviously, in remote working and the overall internet user traffic, and really the rapid uptake of outsourced technology. So this has obviously increased the potential attack surface for many organisations, and the Australian Cyber Security Centre has advised ongoing reports of COVID-related scam frauds and phishing campaigns as hackers seek to exploit the uncertainty around the pandemic. Ransomware, and unfortunately you're going to hear a lot from us today about ransomware and over this series, because it really is starting to quickly reach epidemic levels. And it's not just from a frequency point of view, but it's also from the severity of the demands and the costs associated with containment and rectification. So this is without doubt the most frequently reported claim for this year. We're seeing several large Australian firms falling victim, but it's not just large Australian firms, and I really wanted to caveat that, because it is across the whole of corporate Australia and New Zealand where we're really seeing an uptick here. There's new strains of ransomware, and I put maize in there, but we have heard of their retirement, Tom, haven't we, over the last couple of weeks? They've made enough money and they're moving on. But what their tactic is really to get in there, get as much data as they can, as well as encrypting the systems, and then using that data to incentivize you paying those demands. We've also seen a trend towards larger ransom demands. I think I was saying in 2017, it was 16 and 17 when I first came to Marsh and started building this practice, we're seeing ransom demands of $300, and a good example of that is WannaCry. Over time, we're now seeing demands at a minimum of around $1 million, and this is US dollars. They tend to ask for US. And now it's not, 1 million are not uncommon, and now we've seen a number of demands in our region well over $10 million, which we'll touch on shortly. It's less about security and more about resiliency. It's that old saying, it's not about if, it's when. So it's really around having plans in place to recover it as quickly as possible. And from an Australian point of view, we've seen an increased focus from government and regulators. Cybersecurity strategy released in August outlining a $1.79 billion amount being invested with additional regulatory measures. And this was really in the wake of the PM's announcement. I talk about this announcement often. We were all set in front of our TVs because we were at home at that time, and he pretty much told us not much other than to say that they were aware of some persistent state-based attacks, very sophisticated attacks being aimed at Australia and New Zealand, and we've certainly seen some headlines across both. I might hand back to you, Damien, now.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, Tom, do you have anything to add to those trends?
Just maybe some US exposures.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me. I greatly appreciate it. I hope you all will indulge the silly accent. But I think that's kind of appropriate given the trends we see globally, because the reality is that, you know, the notes change, the words change a little bit, but the song remains the same globally. This is an expression of a trend that we're seeing around the globe. You know, I think as we look at the way that technology has come to dominate the global economy, it is no doubt the reason why we're starting to see this follow-on ongoing growth in cyber events. I think the two things that I would point out for business leaders, you know, we talk about this idea about, you know, moving past security towards resiliency. I think that's really critical. You know, learning to manage cyber risk mirrors something we see called the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grieving, right? Denial, bargaining, anger, and ultimately getting through to acceptance. I think that's very much where organizations are around cyber risk and cyber risk management. And so when we talk about the move from security to resiliency, it really is about the move towards acceptance. I think there was a time, depending on the location in the industry, where as recently as a couple of years ago, organizations talked about investing in cybersecurity to reduce or eliminate their cyber risk. We don't want to have a cyber event. Unfortunately, because of the reality, but fortunately for preparedness, I think we're past that now. And I think there's a recognition that security is not really possible, that we have to be resilient. Organizations have to be flexible and able to respond. And so just as we're talking about resiliency in so many places in the economy, I think when it comes to cyber risk, resiliency really is going to be the name of the game going forward. I also think where we unfortunately have a little bit more of a head start is around the government regulatory focus. We're going to spend a lot of time today talking about ransomware and the threats and the attacks that are actively targeting organizations in Australia, in New Zealand, and around the globe. But where there is a little bit of a difference, and unfortunately a little bit of challenging foreshadowing, is government and regulatory action. In the US, we've been dealing with some very strict privacy regimes since 2006, since surpassed by the GDPR, although we're starting to see a little bit in the tit for tat. Some US states like California are looking to go beyond the GDPR. But around the world, we've just not seen the same level of maturity around the privacy regimes, at least in terms of establishing private standards of care and private rights of action. But when we see what's been going on in Australia, going back to 2018, that's inevitable. And then also the targeting of cyber attacks against local organizations is going to engender a very strong regulatory response. So one area where I do think the US is perhaps unfortunately a little bit further down the road is in the regulatory response, at least in terms of the implications for private industry. I think that is something that's going to rapidly expand, particularly given Australia and New Zealand and their strategic role in the hemisphere. I think that's likely to accelerate in the coming years.
Thanks, Tom. Might Kelly ask you to flick the next slide, because whilst we've got Tom on. Tom, you know, having worked closely with many of the world's largest organisations, what are the trends are you seeing relating to cyber security investment?
Yeah, I think this is a really critical concept, and it builds off what we were talking about on the last slide, which is this notion of moving and looking past a world focused exclusively on cybersecurity. So this is a compendium of data from basically Gartner, looking at spending on cybersecurity around the globe. And what we've seen is that from 2012 to 2019, a period of just 7 years, we saw a 70% increase in cybersecurity spending, $62 billion. That's a lot of money anywhere in the world. What's remarkable, though, is that all of that growth is going to be exceeded over the next 7 years as we see another $98 billion in spending piled on top of that. So organizations are really spending an incredible amount of money on cybersecurity. And not only are they spending that money on cybersecurity, it's going outside the firm. If you look at the balance of trade between spending inside and outside the firm, the vast majority of corporate spending on cybersecurity is on third parties, experts outside the firm to bring tools, products, services, resources, the laundry list of things that we see inside our organizations every day in to try to help solve the cybersecurity problem. So really, when it comes to cybersecurity, it's very clear that we've never spent more. The problem, and I think the challenge that we see, is that despite we've never having spent more, the problem has never been worse, right? If you think about other risk issues in the portfolio, if you saw a $150 billion increase in 15 years, if you saw a consistent compound annual growth rate of 15, 20, 25% in spending for more than a decade, you would hope the problem wouldn't get smaller. Unfortunately, the problem is getting bigger. And so I think what we're seeing is across the board, a couple trends are coming together. One, and we see this in a lot of the research work we do, organizational frustration around cyber risk is increasing. We've already covered how the WEF has identified that cyber remains the #1 business risk issue globally, certainly in advanced economies. Above COVID, by the way, organizations are more scared of cyber risk than they are of COVID. And while that's not true for every single firm, I think it's a remarkable statement across the economy. But we also see frustration with the ability to manage it. And so I think the challenge we're having going forward is as we see this spending increase, the CISO starts running into the CFO. We don't have another $100 billion to spend on this. We don't have another $200 billion to spend on this. We have to do more with less. We have to take more thoughtful approaches based on return on capital. We have to engage in risk management around cyber the way we do around every other risk that faces the business. And I think this slide really is designed to drive that home, to show just how much we've spent on cybersecurity. Much of it important, but ultimately, we still need to think a little bit differently and make a little bit of a change to get ahead of an issue that's still growing.
Right, your stuff. Okay, why don't we dig into some ransomware? Kelly, I'll pose the first one to you. I mean, we're not just seeing claims in the insurance industry, but we're seeing lots of notifications that are coming through that aren't necessarily insured, right? And there's not a week goes by now unless we're seeing something, especially in the Australian press. How has this evolved over time? And given the continued rise of ransomware in both frequency and severity, what impact is this having on clients and insurers?
Well, the simple answer is it's having an enormous impact, and there's no doubt about that. Ransomware really is the key theme these days when it comes to cyber. So cyber risk is compounding and ransomware trends are getting worse. And we've put together a little bit of a table here just to kind of demonstrate the time scale of what we're seeing. It was initially all about data breaches and the policies revolved around that data breach. And that really came in from the changes in the US in 2006. Over time, we then saw the denial of service where they'd lock your system and make a demand, which led to business interruption matters as well. We've always had social engineering and phishing, business email compromise claim in and around there, and more recently ransomware. So it's quite an interesting process, but it really is ransomware that we're seeing the most. So attacks are up 72% during the pandemic. Some of the key stats here: ransom demands rose 31% from Q2 to Q3, with some of the largest demands being in 8 to 9 figures, which I talked about a little bit before. Business downtime, and this is something that I don't think a lot of clients appreciate when we talk to them, is now averages 19 days. That's almost 3 weeks of operational disruption or impairment, and that is up 53%. That has significant consequences, not just on not being able to access your systems, your data, and be able to provide the services to your clients, but also your reputation. It really can have an immediate impact from a reputational point of view. Remediation and recovery costs are growing with the use of new and more complex malware. And this is where we're actually seeing a significant increase in claims costs. I think insurers were aware and have invested heavily in having expertise available for clients, but the cost associated with rectification and containment has grown significantly. And roughly 50% of ransomware attacks now include, as we talked about, stealing data. This is their core tactic now because data has so much value, and they're using this to try and make you pay those demands. It's still early days to quantify the severity outside of extortion demands themselves, since the BI, business interruption adjustment process, is not typically a quick one, but extortion demands themselves have the ability to very quickly wipe out a relatively small cyber market. When I say small, I am referring to our region, but even globally when you compare it to any other class of insurance as well. We're seeing some very high profile claims here, and we have a very small premium pool as well. But the other comment I will make when we talk about stealing data, that brings together the whole holistic look at cyber. We're now talking about your systems have been encrypted, you immediately have business interruption issues, the ransom extortion demand is there, but they've got your data. So you are now obliged to immediately notify the regulators that there may be a data privacy breach as well. Tom, do you have anything to add to this slide?
Well, it's not all good news, Kelly. There's some downsides too. No, in all seriousness, I think that one of the challenges is, we call this slide internally the wave. And I think the challenge is that the wave continues to build. All of these things can befall an organization at any particular time. And so it really is a very perilous environment. And I think it also highlights, again, that theme we'll talk about again and again about risk management and resilience, why organizations need to anticipate that cyber events are going to happen rather than try to attempt to make sure that they never occur, because it's just, you can't possibly cover everything. But also, I think the challenge of being resilient, recognizing that these are big, significant events, they're multifaceted. You never know exactly what they're going to look like coming out of the gate. And so that ability to be flexible and bounce back is really critical. The marginal utility for a lot of firms is going to come around becoming more resilient, more able to respond and bounce back, rather than attempting to continue to strengthen fortifications that ultimately at some point in time only need to be breached once to cause a potentially challenging event.
Tom, whilst I've got you, and just bear with me, I'm going to slowly provide some context behind this next question. I think it's one of the better questions in one sense, one of the most interesting ones anyway. The US Treasury, sorry,
it's certainly one of the most popular.
It's the US Treasury Department recently signaled potentially more aggressive enforcements of sanctions and anti-money laundering laws against those paying ransoms to blacklisted cyber criminals. So it's only a matter of time before we see some similar guidance here locally. The move comes as companies are facing an onslaught of ransomware attacks and an ongoing debate about the trade-offs between making such payments or risking the loss of business critical data. So how do clients ensure they remain on the right side of the law? And how does an insurance policy play a role in this?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first thing is that a lot of the battle here is won or lost in the preparation. So one of the specific questions we get a lot is this question of to pay or not to pay. And then this question of the U.S. Treasury, OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, which is the specific guidance. OFAC and what are the implications around the ability to pay? The first thing is the time to figure out if you're going to pay is probably before you have the event, not during, because it becomes considerably more stressful. And so we would encourage organizations to have really frank internal discussions around their desire to potentially participate in the payment of a ransom. And it needs to be really thoughtful, because it's very easy to say, well, we'll never pay a ransom, but it's quite a different thing when you're facing the potential effective termination of the organization because they've managed to encrypt all of your data. And by the way, they're really good at this. You can't just say, oh, we've got backups. One of the things that we see, and I think Kelly hinted at this before, is the attackers will get in and they'll dwell. They'll hang out in your organization for weeks or months. They'll silently turn off or corrupt the backups. So when you go to pull them, there's no actual data there. You can't just assume that a good copy of backups is going to be enough. What if it's going to take you 2 weeks to restore and trust the data? So really getting confident about your organization's policy around payment of ransoms is, I think, critical to be prepared. The specific question we're dealing with a lot is this public policy issue. And this is where, as we talked about before, we're seeing public policy just start to get caught up with the cyber reality. A lot of the threat actors that organizations are facing, the people who come in and launch cyber attacks, are located in jurisdictions that are, or working for organizations that are sanctioned. So we know this is a cash raiser for North Korea. We see a lot of malware activity out of Iran, out of state-sponsored or state-associated groups in Russia and China. That's undeniable. And so there's a real concern, particularly for some of the more extreme regimes, that payment of ransoms is funding these regimes. You're taking money out of the Australian and New Zealand economy and giving it directly to these regimes. And so we're seeing regulators crack down on that. Now, the specific guidance in question is about a month and a half ago. The U.S. Treasury came out with revised guidance highlighting to organizations that you cannot make ransom payments in circumvention of sanctions. Now, this was not a new position. This has been the position for years. You've never been able to make payments in contravention of sanctions, but this time they really meant it. So don't do it. And so that's caused a lot of people to re-examine their positions. But again, you've never been able to make payments in contravention of sanctions, and that doesn't change it. Specifically, I think in the Australia and New Zealand market, two things to consider. One, it may not necessarily be about whether or not Australia and New Zealand have sanctions. If your financial institution, if your forensic investigator, if your law firm, if anyone associated in any way with the payment of this ransom has nexus in the US, they are subject to these rules. This is where the globalization of commerce starts to bite. The sanctions regulations, and this is true generally, tend to be some of the strictest regulations organizations have. So they have anti-facilitation clauses, which means that no one along the chain can support it. They also tend to be global. So it doesn't matter if it's just one local branch. A US Nexus organization cannot facilitate in any way. So even if you say, oh, it's not an issue for me because of where I'm located, it may very well be if you're using a bank that has operations in the US and would like to keep them. The second thing is that we will see more sanctions from local jurisdictions because nobody wants to be facilitating these bad actors. So it's really important that organizations use trusted experts. There are specialist firms who have expertise as intermediaries to go through the process of evaluating sanctions compliance and giving organizations confidence that the threat actor they're going to pay is not on a sanction list. And so I just can't stress it enough. We've set a policy within MMC that unless the organization works with a specialist evaluator to make that sanctions check, that we won't be able to participate in or necessarily be able to participate in the payment or recovery of sanctions. That's the other thing when it comes to the insurance recovery. You may make the payment on your own, but your insurance carrier may not be able to reimburse you if you've not gone through sanctions checks. So if this is all a very long-winded way of saying sanctions checks and specialist firms, then hopefully the message has gotten through. But what I also think that is that this highlights, again, where we are in terms of regulatory developments around cyber risk. It's still very early days. There's a lot of early, moving parts, and a lot of regulatory activity remains focused on consumer privacy and national security. And so cyber remains one of those issues where on a relative basis, relative to what most organizations experience daily, the cavalry is not necessarily on the way. The ability for law enforcement to step in to help the firm, to help you recover very significantly, but claim by claim, but I think is a little bit different than what we would expect in the physical world in the event of a theft or robbery. It's just a little bit more of the Wild West right now.
Yeah, I think the main point you've made there too, Tom, is let's not worry. Don't wait until the claim is actually made or the ransom has been done. Clients need to have these decisions formulated and have their structure in place, ready to go before the matter. So,
and they need to practice their response.
Yeah,
I can't stress that enough. I think organizations put playbooks together, and you imagine them unfolding in a certain way. And the reality is that cyber events are sudden and violent, and particularly ransomware. In many circumstances, the first notice you have that anything's wrong is receipt of the ransom demand, and they'll often ask for remittance of the ransom in a matter of days, if not hours. And so the idea that you have time to take a step back and let's think about this, that's not necessarily realistic. Very frequently, we see clients, we get phone calls on a literal daily basis. We need help, we need to get a ransom paid, and we have 4 hours. We have 6 hours. The preparation, the training, the rehearsal, it can't just be a tabletop walkthrough once a year. This is where the resilience comes from, the discipline of again and again practicing and rehearsing stressful scenarios. That's how you're going to be able to respond quickly and effectively.
Yeah, and I guess the two final points on this is, when COVID came along, a lot of companies literally dusted off their business continuity plans. But when you look at ransomware, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So we can't afford to have dust gathering on our plans. Okay, we might move along, just conscious of time, and talk about the insurance market. So Kelly, how has the cyber insurance market reacted to the increase in claims activity being experienced? And do you see an increased demand for purchasing standalone cyber policies?
Absolutely. So the market has, I think they're doing a deep dive think at the moment. I think that's probably the best way we can describe it, can't we, Tom? I think that whilst they did anticipate an increase of claim activities, I don't think they anticipated how much they would cost. And when I talked about the increasing cost in containment and rectification forensic work, I think that is where they've probably been caught out a little bit. We also had a very competitive market to start with. We had insurers that were obviously looking to build portfolios and get some premium under their belts. So it was a very good time to buy a few years ago. So whilst there are some adjustments being made, we still have robust capacity within the market. We say that overall there is about 750, but more realistically, we're finding it a bit more difficult to build towers over $350 million at the moment. Physical damage, which we'll touch on. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on the insurance market update because I think we really want to concentrate on silent cyber and the issues that's causing. And this does change regularly. There is a demand now to look for solutions in this area. However, there is a lack of capacity, and we'll touch on that shortly. A lot of carriers are looking to manage their line size and looking to deploy a maximum of 10 to 15, which is a big change for us. We were seeing some insurers put out up to $50 million on any one risk. With the rates increasing across all industry classes, insurers are becoming more comfortable walking away from opportunities, which is a real change that we hadn't seen before if they're not comfortable with the rate being adequate. And we have seen some markets exit earlier this year. From a coverage perspective, I think this is where we're really going to see some changes. It's fair to say that cyber coverage became very broad very quickly. And I think insurers are starting to reassess whether they're comfortable in providing all of those add-ons that we've spoken a lot to all of the clients on the phone, on this call, sorry. War and infrastructure exclusions continue to be focused by several insurers in response to pressures from reinsurance treaties and Lloyd's. We're starting to see sublimits reappear, particularly for those additional coverage areas that we were talking about, such as reputational harm, critical supply chain, which extends beyond IT vendors, bricking and betterment. Betterment is always an interesting discussion with insurers. Insurers are starting to look and put pressure on retentions. They want clients to have a bit more skin in the game, as they would say. And due to ransomware claims, we're seeing some carriers look to reduce their losses with sublimits or co-insurance, although that is at a very early stage. From a premium perspective, there is rate pressure. We are in Q3, we saw an average of 10 to 20% increase. But if these claims trends continue, and there's nothing to suggest that they won't, this could quickly increase as well. So we'll all keep you posted in relation to that. The biggest area we're seeing on rate pressure is the excess layers. So if you have a large program, I think when we talk about the frequency, we knew that they were there. It's really the severity where it's really starting to exhaust towers. So excess capacity is really looking to push for rates. There will be challenging reinsurance renewals coming up, which you touched on earlier, Damien. So we will be in a better position in early January to give you a bit of an update of what we think will come out of that, and there will be no doubt that there will be a focus on coverage. So from a claims point of view, COVID obviously raised concerns within the market, but they haven't really transpired to impact the cyber market significantly. We did see a lot of scamming and social engineering. However, that generally falls within crime. The most impacted industries that we're seeing are financial services, manufacturing, and professional services. However, around Australia, it seems to be a bit of a scattergun approach. There doesn't appear to be any real segment that or industry that hasn't been hit with all the persistent attacks that we are seeing. And I think that's really all I've got from a local perspective. Tom, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, just continuing my role as the contrarian, what I would say is that it's not quite as bad as all that. You know, first of all, I think one of the things is that claims are getting paid. You know, obviously every now and then we see stories in the news around a cyber event that doesn't get reimbursed for whatever reason. But I would tell you that those things are really only newsworthy because they are the exception rather than the rule. So the reality is that underneath it, the cyber market continues to function very well, and clients are making recoveries on these policies on a regular basis. That's one of the reasons why we're seeing rates go up, is because claims are being paid. And so I think that's a very good story. And I'd also say that claim recovery on cyber policies tends to be relatively straightforward. I think we've done a really good job broadening the contract over the past couple of years. And typically when something comes up, the contract expands to absorb it, rather than we see carriers look to add exclusions. So overall, the claim recovery side is pretty bullish. The other thing I'd caution is I think a lot of clients where they look at these numbers and they say, well, this is it. And why would I buy this product? It's not going to be here in 2 or 3 years. But I think that on the positive side, we have to recognize a couple things. One, this is the risk of the 21st century, and carriers know that and want to be in this business. They will continue to evolve how they structure and price and create programs. But the amount of capacity that's available, the relative pricing has all been very positively developing over the past 10 to 20 years. We have more capacity, prices have continued to come down. Even though prices are up now, they're still lower than they were 5 years ago. So overall, the market continues to grow and expand quite healthily. And I think that that will continue. I also think that this market ultimately is insurable, because one thing we've seen, and you think about that wave slide, is that a lot of these events are episodic. We had a wave of data breaches back in the 2000s in the US, but then organizations learned how to protect data and encrypt remote, portable devices. We had a huge wave of credit card breaches, but then we learned how to secure credit card data and finally adopted chip and PIN. And lo and behold, credit card data is some of the safest data organizations hold right now. Today, we're dealing with ransomware attacks. But what we know is that the industry will adapt and respond. It's going to be a rugged couple years, but much like we've seen with the pandemic, there is an ability to adapt and respond. It's not like being stuck on the coastline in an age of global warming where there's just nowhere to go. You can move the building, you can make changes, you can protect the firm. So yeah, things are definitely a lot different than they were 12 to 18 months ago. The market's gotten firmer and certain elements have gotten more challenging. But on an overall macro perspective, it still remains a very good story, and one that we think will continue to evolve very favorably for clients over the coming years.
Thanks, Tom. Kelly, you mentioned silent cyber, so I'd like to move on to silent cyber at the moment, because I think we'll find that most, if not all, people on this call will either have been impacted or will be impacted by silent cyber coming up. We're now experiencing insurers right across the world looking to affirm or exclude cyber risks from most other classes of insurance, including property, which is the big one at the moment, casualty, and more recently, we're seeing on the financial lines policies. So Kelly, can you first provide us with a brief overview of what silent cyber is and why has it become a big issue now?
Yeah, sure. So it is something that has absolutely taken over our world from a cyber perspective, and it is a word that we want to go like this, but we can't. So silent cyber refers to the exposure to cyber losses, as you said, Damien, within traditional property, casualty, and other non-cyber insurance policies that have not been expressly affirmed or excluded. Therefore, the exposure is considered silent, and insurers and regulators have expressed their concern that this exposure, which they contend they have been neither underwritten for nor priced, can create unmeasured portfolio exposure and could lead to aggregated systemic risk. So insurers are responding by adapting various exclusions, limitations, and changes to non-cyber insurance policy. And this is also now reaching financial lines. I think we talk a lot about property and casualty, but we are certainly seeing some pressure on the financial lines policies as well. These changes can lead to coverage uncertainty and confusion and may create coverage gaps that impact or limit coverage for cyber risk. Markets really are at a standstill on which classes of insurance should cover this, e.g. should physical damage caused by a cyber event be covered under property or cyber policy. So taking a bit deeper look at this, I really like this slide because it really just sets it out in plain view as to where the concern is. So what's a cyber event? It's a malicious act or accidental event impacting either your data, your computer networks, or technology. And then what's the impact? So the impacts we have seen is the obvious ones that we talk about from the cyber insurance side: the encryption of data, the security breach, the privacy violation, the regulatory investigation. So when we look at that, that's in yellow. And then we're kind of moving into the phishing and fraud. So we're talking about crime now, bricked computers. So when your laptop is rendered useless, the replacement of that hardware. And then we get into that physical damage and bodily injury side of things that can be caused from a cyber event. You know, a fire, a thermostat being, the temperature being increased, which leads to an explosion and a resulting fire. That property damage, a car's IoT being corrupted and the car drives into, into the sea. I'm trying to see what that illustration is there. So what are the consequences? You know, it is that first party, the loss of income, the third party, the fines and penalties. We're talking about the extortion demands, and then we're moving on to that negligence in service and shareholders litigation. One of the big questions we get at the moment is the impact on the D&O side of things as well.
So Tom, you know, so two questions for you. Is there a collective market view on what silent cyber is, how to define cyber, and how to approach the issue? And then to close off the question, what's Marsh doing about this issue?
Yeah, great questions. You know, in terms of what Marsh has been doing, you know, we have had dozens of colleagues engaged on this topic globally for several years now. So we've been way at the front of this for a long time. And so there's a lot of knowledge. I think clients should take comfort in the fact that we are as all over this as we can be, given how fastly it's evolving. I think if you wanted to try to boil all of silent cyber down to one single concise definition, silent cyber is the cyber problem embedded in every policy other than cyber, right? When it comes to silent cyber, it's everybody else's issue. It's the cyber problem that's not in cyber. And I think the big question, as we saw on the previous slide, is what to do with physical cyber. Something goes wrong with a computer and something happens in the physical world. What to do with non-physical cyber, where it's pretty clear that's for the cyber market. And then what do you do with the stuff in the middle, like bricking? Where stuff, you know, where devices have been hacked, they're not broken, but you can't trust them anymore. I think that's kind of where we're moving, is we recognize that the non-physical cyber needs to move to the cyber market. And our goal is to make sure that clients preserve as much of the physical cyber in their traditional property, casualty, and related policies. And the stuff in the middle, we'll figure out.
Scott, I'd like to bring you into this. I mean, you're talking to clients every day, and I know this topic has come up. What are the likely challenges ahead for clients do you see?
Yeah, I think Tom and Kelly's expressed it well. To me, and from the conversations we have, you know, silent cyber, just like cyber, it's a global issue, and for the market at the moment, it's a fairly dysfunctional one. And I think, you know, to sort of understand where it's going is to understand why the insurers are doing what they're doing at the moment. And the problem is that the expertise for cyber doesn't exist within the property and casualty, and to a lesser extent, the financial lines areas of these insurance companies. They don't actually have the data or the understanding of the risk to be able to underwrite it, nor do they have the ability to think about what the aggregation of exposures would be. And so, you know, the underwriters, if we can be fair to them to one degree, is to try to make sure that they're going to be around to pay the losses that they intend to cover for clients and not get taken out by, you know, huge aggregation from a global cyber event that, you know, causes a whole bunch of claims under policies where they didn't intend to provide the cover. So we kind of get that. But the issue we've got at the moment is we have a complete lack of consistency in approach between insurers. You know, and most of our clients, you know, on this webinar will be having, you know, proportional insurance programs, multi-layered insurance programs as well. But we also have lack of consistency within underwriters across product lines. And so we have a situation sometimes where you have, you know, different coverage per underwriter on one particular policy for a client. So there's an issue with what actually is the cover. And then secondly, there's an issue with how is a claim going to work? And so, you know, there are solutions in the marketplace to cover some of the gaps where Tom was talking about in the middle there, Brit, Munich Re and others, but not really for limits of liability of the type that many of our clients are going to need if you think about the property and the business interruption exposures. So we've got this task force, as Tom alluded to, that has been working on this issue for some time, taking it up to the leaders of the insurance companies and also reinsurance companies. And a lot of that work to date has been of a technical nature, getting to understand this so we can advise our clients appropriately and looking to recommend technical solutions for the underwriters to take on board. but for whatever reason, they haven't been too forthcoming on the solution department. And so I just got an update from one of our placement colleagues this morning. Lucy Clark globally and the placement team are also joining in on this fight as well, because whilst we think it's a neat solution to have commonly applied clauses that we can communicate to our clients exactly what's covered, the market will agree to give, and then we can identify exactly where the gap is and develop an appetite in the marketplace to cover that. That's a good idea. We're going to need to also apply some leverage where we can. It's a little bit like, D&O class actions in a way, which is, the claims continue to come through. Until recently, not many clients have been willing to take up the fight. Sooner or later, got to take up the fight. So if we can present options and hold certain lead markets to account, we're going to have to see if we can be prepared to move some business so the insurers know that this is something that clients and the broking community feel strongly about, and we can try and make a bit of a difference. Because failing that, I see this continuing to go on with this lack of consistency for 12 months at least.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Conscious of time, so what we'll do, because we want to do some Q&As, the whole silent cyber thing can go on for a long time, so we can always come back at another time and respond to any questions there. What we might do, Kelly, is any final advice to clients before we start the Q&A?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we have a whole lot of advice that we can provide clients and are providing clients, but I think this slide really captures where the main points that we want to get across. It's really important from a risk management imperative that you understand the nature of the risk you face, considering current circumstances in the environment. So we will continue to keep you updated on that landscape and talk to you about that. But what we need you to do is really understand that risk, and we can certainly help you do that. Be prepared to understand threats and associated exposures, confirm mitigation plans, and particularly in relation to your VCP and your supply chain risk. Explore opportunities for risk transfer, either via enhancement or revised insurances. And as Tom said, we cannot stress this enough. Conduct practical exercises for your most present risks. We talked about ransomware today. Test, play them out, scenarios. And again, talk to us. We are seeing the claims. We are seeing how they are unfolding. We are experiencing the pain points that clients are experiencing when they're going through these. So please reach out to us. We are more than happy to contribute to any of those. So they're really the key points we wanted to get across today. We've got a lot more coming up in the next 5 parts of our masterclass series that will cover a lot of these topics in a lot more in depth. But hopefully today this gives you a good high level overview of what the message that we really want to impart with you.
Excellent, thanks, Kelly. I've just got a few quick questions. Tom, I'll pose the first one to you that's been provided by the audience. How is the move away from internally hosted servers to external cloud-based changing the landscape of cyber attacks, or is there no change to the business risk?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and this is the great cloud question. So first of all, people need to recognize that the move to the cloud for a significant fraction of risks is one of the single greatest things you can do to reduce your organization's cyber risk. The cloud these days is very much like where we were with electrification and the development of the grid 100 years ago. Just like nobody puts a water wheel next to their textile mill anymore, the things that organizations can do in terms of cloud management, not only in terms of the economics of the cloud, but also in terms of the ability to bring security resources to bear, are extraordinary. So I think we have to recognize that the cloud makes things safer. And in fact, what we've seen is that 2 of the organizations in the US who suffered extremely large, well-known cyber events, Equifax and I believe also Capital One, have responded by moving everything to the cloud, have no internal data centers whatsoever. Now, the cloud certainly creates new kinds of dependency, and I think highlights the fact that we're in this hyper-connected technology environment. And that does bring its own risks. But against the core set of classical risks, the move to the cloud is really, really a positive thing, and organizations should embrace it.
Thanks, Tom. Kelly, next, and we might make this a final one. Scott might have a comment on this as well, but given current market challenges in terms of cost available capacity, are you seeing increased utilisation of captives on cyber-related risks? And if so, in what ways?
So we're certainly seeing a lot more discussion in relation to the utilisation of captives and whether that is something that clients should investigate. At this time, and as Tom mentioned before, from a market perspective, it's still robust, it's still competitive, and we've found that at this time the premiums are competitive enough, and in comparison with also how broad the coverage is, that captive utilisation hasn't really taken off from our perspective. Tom, you might have a different experience from a US perspective.
No, we see captives used a lot, and I think we'll see them used more.
Yeah.
I think the threshold question for us is, how do you normally use your captive? In the US, a lot of organizations use their captives for risk finance, for high volume, low volatility claims like workers' comp. Those organizations typically don't want to expose their captive to the volatility of cyber risk. But for more sophisticated organizations who are more comfortable managing and actively managing cyber risk, we see captives used all the time, filling gaps in the tower, solving international coverage problems, any number of different issues. I think it just has to do with what the organization's fundamental willingness to engage in active risk management. That tends to be the driver.
Excellent. Well, we might finish up there. There are a couple of other questions there, but what we'll do is we'll provide a written response to those questions. What I will say is to obviously thank you to the panel, and thank you all for attending today's masterclass. The next one is on Thursday, the 19th of November, starting at 11, finishing at 12. We'll look at the important topic of addressing the governance challenges around security. So hopefully you can all make it again. Thank you all very much for your time and enjoy your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.